I was born and brought up in a small Midwestern town, as many folks were, where you didn't have one or two parents, you had 100. It was a really good place to grow up. My biggest accomplishment, to be honest with you, when I was growing up was I was a fairly good football player. Our football team wasn't big, we weren't fast, we weren't mean, didn't have a lot of ability. However, we went undefeated my senior year. No one could beat us because we worked together. That principle has never left me. I have seen the church, I have seen the relationships I have as a team. I don't do anything without a team. I see my life as being a part of a team. So, when I went to college in 1966, Shelby was an all-white town at that time, as many Midwestern towns were. But my mom had always taught me to love people who were different than I was. So immediately, I became involved in the civil rights movement at Ohio University. And then something horrible happened. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and I was crushed. I was so idealistic back at that time, and I thought, how can they do this? How can something like this, so evil, happen? And I came to a crisis of faith. What came back to me were the words of my longtime pastor at First United Methodist Church in Shelby, Ohio. He said, nothing will ever come right in the world until you take care of the sin that's in your own heart. So as I mulled over those words day after day, finally I went one night to Galbraith Chapel in the middle of the Ohio University campus, and I knelt down. I gave my whole life to Jesus Christ. A short time later, I felt called into ministry. You remember what Jesus said was the most important commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And so taking from that great commandment, those were the two areas that I wanted to address. As a pastor, I was called to help the church be active outside the walls of the church, mostly in pro-life issues. And when I say that, I mean, it wasn't that I was just interested in ending abortion, which I still am, but I was interested in protecting the vulnerable outside the womb as well. The babies that were born and the adults that were growing in a world but still very vulnerable. So all of the issues in which I advocate that we take a moral responsibility are biblical admonitions that protect the vulnerable. My advocacy for peace, for the poor, for victims of human trafficking, in the protection of God's creation for the sake of the most vulnerable victims of pollution-caused climate change, for the inclusion in the church and in society of families and persons dealing with disabilities, for racial equality and reconciliation, and on and on and on. All of those have biblical marching orders from God. And so I believe that's a part of the scriptural voice God wants us to have in this world. My involvement in public policy often takes the form of being a pastor who relates to public officials. The problems we face in this world are too big for any one faith group to address. So in addition to being good representatives and witnesses of Jesus, we also want to be cooperative in the practical solutions for the world's biggest problems, especially for the protection of the most vulnerable.